And I'm afraid this fashion for, I think it's called ESG capitalism, in my view, is nothing more, frankly, than grandstanding and virtue signaling by people who should know better.
It was indeed a little after 1 o'clock this morning when news came that Alison Rose had resigned as head of NatWest. One of her critics was David Davis, Conservative MP for Halton, Price and Howden. Morning, David.
Good morning.
This felt maybe inevitable as soon as actually the Times front page dropped last night, because it was clear people like you were very critical. The cabinet was very critical. I think 3 people were in the cabinet were saying she had to go. Was this inevitable? Is it the right move?
Well, I think it was inevitable. I mean, if an ordinary bank clerk in your local bank, if you have one, would get fired out of hand for discussing the affairs of one of the customers. I mean, confidentiality is pretty much the first duty of the bank. The only people it's allowed to discuss your affairs with are the tax authorities, the police sometimes, the regulatory authorities, but nobody else. So it's a pretty high-level error for any member of a bank, let alone the chief executive. So that's the sort of first thing. It also appears that when the BBC journalist involved, Jack, went back to confirm it, it was confirmed. It wasn't even a sort of an accidental thing, which they could have said, well, sorry, we didn't mean that, or whatever later on. So number one, it's a right thing to happen. I suspect it won't be the last departure, frankly, from the NatWest Group.
Do you think Howard Davis needs to go, David Davis? He's the boss of it.
No, I'm not sure about that. What I do think is that the chief executive of Coutts itself is in a difficult position, and he hasn't responded to any questions from Mr. Farage in the last few days. I think he's had about 3 letters he hasn't responded to. He's got a question to answer too. I mean, people shouldn't have their bank accounts withdrawn in this day and age for their political views. End of story.
Well, that's the point. That's an interesting point, though. We're talking about Alison Rose resigning. Has she resigned because she was indiscreet to a BBC journalist who maybe got a bit quick to publish the story, so it was traced back to her and turned out not to be true? That's one thing. That's quite an inside baseball argument. Or is there a broader problem for which she had to go, which was if you don't agree with a certain set of liberal consensus views, in some banks, clearly, you're considered beyond the pale and shouldn't have a bank account.
Right. Well, what you touched on, the inside baseball thing, is the absolute slam dunk. That's what meant she had to go. The issue of withdrawing somebody's bank account for their views, I hate to say it, but I suspect it's going to prove to be much wider than just Coutts. In the coming weeks, I've come across it. I've even had restrictions on my bank account, not for reasons of my political views, but because I'm a politically exposed person. But I think the banks have been behaving collectively in a rather strange way on all this, and forgetting that their customers had rights.
And what strange way are you talking about here? I'm really interested in this because we haven't quite managed to nail this down, I think, yet. You say it's coming out, which I think is probably right. Is there this sort of, it's called by critics sort of woke corporatism, the idea that businesses now have to espouse a certain set of values in public because they feel that's the right thing for their brands, and therefore that their customers must have to accord with that? Do you think in banks around the country, people's opinions are being sifted and people are losing their rights because of those opinions?
Well, it looks like they are, absolutely. And the banks, of course, have always hidden behind the line, well, we don't have to provide a bank account. We can choose our own customers, which for most companies is true. Most parts of the free market, that's true. You don't have to do business with somebody. Unfortunately, in this day and age, having a bank account is almost as essential as having a water supply or an electricity supply. You can't, as of last week, you can't even get a railway ticket because there are no more ticket stations and so on. So you've got to ensure that people have that right. And banks have taken it upon themselves to say, oh, well, we don't have to provide it. And they've done this time and time again. There was a debate in the Lords, I think it was June the 13th, about this. And the number of people who popped up and said, well, actually, I've had my bank account or taken away, or my American Express card. That was, I think, Ken Clark and I think Michael Forsyth, some pretty well-known people had their accounts stopped for really very trivial reasons. this behaviour by the banks, it's elided from what was initially a piece of European law called dealing with politically exposed persons, and it's elided into something much bigger. On the one hand, it was to try and prevent corruption. Now it's to try and become a sort of marketing arm of the bank, which is absolutely ridiculous. Nobody should, and frankly, nobody should know who's got an account with each bank. That's a private between the individual and the bank. It certainly shouldn't be a part of its sort of self-regarding marketing, which is what this appears to have turned into. And in my view, it's completely wrong. I mean, it's wrong for all sorts of reasons, but it's wrong in denying somebody a fundamental right. In Mr. Farage's case, a business account. I mean, he was offered after he went public with it. He was offered a NatWest personal account, but they didn't offer him a business account. So it's pretty shoddy behaviour. Just
before you go, you're a liberal Tory, David. I think it's fair to say. What do you make of this notion of woke corporatism? Do you think that is a thing that businesses are much more interested in sort of politics and liberal politics than they ever were before? It becomes part of brand identity and therefore sort of gets into corporate culture, perhaps in an unhelpful way. What do you make of that as an idea?
Well, frankly, I think it's slightly nuts. I mean, yeah, I've been fighting some of the battles they're now espousing for 30 odd years. I can tell you there have been plenty of times along the way when business hasn't been very helpful, but it does absolutely nothing for the public good. I mean, that's the test. Does it help the public in some way that a company will perhaps talk to its PR company and say, well, which stance should we take on this or that issue? Where should we place ourselves? Frankly, their job is to provide their services, give their shareholders a return, provide employment for their people, and obey the law. Those are the primary things that should happen. I'm afraid this fashion for, I think it's called ESG capitalism, in my view, is nothing more, frankly, than grandstanding and virtue signaling by people who should know better. People who are paid a hell of a lot more than you or I, mostly. Well, me anyway. I can't speak for you, and should know better than to really waste social resources. We now see impinge on people's rights rather than extend them. I think they should go back to the day job. Get that right first, and the people will be very happy with them. Most people buying a pair of shoes or a radio or a hamburger are not thinking about what the company does at its board level meetings and what stances it strikes. They're thinking about, are they getting a good deal? Are they getting a good product? Is it quality? Is it healthy? Those are sensible things to worry about. So-called woke capitalism I think it's going to be a passing mad phase.